to be able to, you know, delete task. Yep, font awesome. And then let's say take this button, wrap it in a, oops. Wrap it in a div. Make it flag so the button is on one side and then the icon is on the other side. Now we need to import whatever we pass in here. ELT, here we have it. It will automatically import, but if it doesn't do that for you, this is the import statement. Add some padding around it. We can also update the size of those icons. I'm going to set it to large. And then let's do onClick statement and handle task delete, which we'll create right now. Delete. And closing tag. Calling the delete task function. As for variables, passing ID would be ID. And then also once this gets deleted, we also need to like handle, like close the model. That I missed actually, just because in the function in the update function we indicated that string is required, like to pass the ID, because it needs to know which task to update, and the ID is the only source of truth. We need to indicate that this is required using exclamation mark here as well, otherwise it will throw an error. We also have to, in here, I think I missed, we have to provide the status. So status would be the section name. So I guess in board section, we do need to pass its name to task component as well. So board category equals title, yeah. And then update the props here. Status would be board category. This is complaining because here we have indicated the type task, and task does not have this section, but we can go to the type definition and add it as like optional. that's a string now. So if we go to 4, it's gonna get updated. Great. So the next feature that we want to work on is that we want to be able to drag this task and be able to drop in any of the sections that we would like. And then what's gonna happen when this gets dropped is that the task status on the backend needs to be updated. So to be able to enable this functionality of like dragging and dropping, I did use this library React Beautiful DND. Indeed, there were few of the React libraries that used to do that, but I did some research and found that this would be most suitable for our use case. So let me show you a quick example of how it works. This could be, you can define like any like column or box or container from which you can drag and drop, and then as you can see, you can also like change the order of elements. So a little bit more details into, and it is accessible, which is why like another good reason to use it. So you can do like keyboard dragging. So a little bit more into like how it works. You can see it has 3 different types of components. Drag and drop context is basically all the area that you want to be able in which to move the components around. So in our case, that area would be this like board itself, because anywhere on the board we can move the tasks. Then the next one is droppable, so it could be like taken from anywhere point A could be located in drag drop context, and then point B would be the droppable, so anywhere that something could be dropped and then we fire some function. And in this case, the droppable would be the sections, because we want to be able to drop into them. Next one is draggable. So draggable is anything that you can press your mouse on and then drag it around. In our case, this would be the tasks itself. Alright, let's start adding this component. First, let's do the drag drop context in our board. Oh well, I guess first we have to install the npm install React Beautiful DND. Loading, I'll paste the drag drop context in here. And then wrap the board component with it. So drag drop context. So just because this has, we're using TypeScript, we also need to install the types for it. So install -save types. Yeah, and then for this one, here we indicate what happens when something is like dragged and it's over. So on drag end, which is the function that I'll create now. And then you can pass the object where the result was dragged into. So the droppable IDs. So this result can be destructured into 3 objects, which is destination, source, and then draggable ID. We will declare each one of this once we have all the components in place for this to work, but the basic destination is where where the draggable item ended up, sources, where was it coming from. We're not gonna like really use this. We care more about destination. And then draggable ID is the ID of the item that you're moving around. In our case, that's a task. And then let's just console log just result for now. Okay, so the next step, as I showed, is to define droppable ID. So go to, here we are at the board section. We're gonna import this in here, and then we will wrap the, so not including the model, just the section without the header. So maybe like here. Yeah, I think this is the best place to draw. And here we need to pass the ID, which will be like the title of the section. And close this out after the container. Okay. So, and then there's syntax for the way we should also do this, because there's an item provided that gets like passed. So in here, let's close this. And in here, and here we have provided placeholder. Okay. So I'm not sure string is not assignable to type string. Yeah, the string is primitive type, and then string is for a project. I guess it's fine for now, because if we change, we can actually change the type of this. Okay, string maybe. Still no. Okay, got it. So import draggable. Same thing, we need to wrap the task itself. Draggable. Give it an ID, which would be just the ID of the task. Yep. Index, are we passing index in here? Not really. Okay, we can. So we just want cart to be draggable, not really, like we don't care about the model. So wrap this, pass the provided. I think that should be. Oh, we do need the index equals. Okay, let's pass index in here then. index, and then go to the board section. Okay, and pass it in. And then update the task type, index optional, I believe it's a number, but its value is never read. Okay, yeah, pass it in here. Undefined. Now if we go back to board section, we also need to pass in like reference to this object, to this like div, I guess, to provide it so it can access it basically, and then do the rest for the props provided dot droppable props side in here, because we're referring to the container. Yeah. Same way we passed reference for droppable, we need to do the same thing for draggable, because we have this provided here, and then in this one and then reference equals provided dot in inner ref. Right out now, as you can see, we can indeed drag and drop, and animations are pretty neat, but if you notice, if we like drop here, it's not gonna stay here, it's gonna move back, because this is reading the data from the API, and then in the API user testing task has indeed status in progress. That's why we have not, so this is expected because we have not finished writing this function on drag end. It was in board actually here. And then we're gonna add update task here, get the ID and then the status that needs to be updated, and make an API call. Do some quick checking before we actually update the task. Let's say if we do not have a destination, so probably task was dragged but never really like put anywhere, so then just like stop the function. If destination droppable ID is the same as the source, then also like do nothing. If not, then we do update the task. For that, we need to have the update task query in here. Let's copy it from the task component, and also add our use mutation in here. Create the function, pass the query name, and call it in here. As for variables, we don't pass all of the fields for task, just because we need only ID to identify which task got updated, and then this ID would be the draggable ID, since task is the draggable item, and then only status got updated in this process, so status would be destination droppable ID. This one we were creating like items using draggable and droppable. We did pass IDs as you recall, so we're just using those. So this from task component, we do look at the fields that we want to be. For example, we don't want title to be required or description, as well as status. So we make them optional. Actually, status can be required and we're passing it. Okay, let's save this, reload it. As you can see, there was for 1 second it got back to where it was before and then came back. That's because the data was cached, and after a certain time, after the component was updated, then it got reloaded. To like avoid this, obviously what we can do is update cache in GraphQL. So the way it's done is that there's two ways we can do that. One would be to use the cache object and then read the query and write the query in the cache object of the GraphQL. Another way would be just to update the state itself. How to update cache in Apollo using, so we have read query, write query, and update query, similar to the other GraphQL queries that we were using before. And there's also a way to directly modify the cache using cache modify. So this is the example of queries. We declare the query like we have, and then after that we use this hook to update it. So this is one way to do it. I guess a simpler way to do it is to just update the state in our local like board component, and then when the page reloads, it will automatically like fetch all the like the new queries either way. So let's do that. In order to do that, we're gonna create a state that's gonna hold all the tasks instead of, because right now we have it as a data. So let's create the state for that. Constant set tasks, use state, and then what we want is that every time the page loads and this query runs, we want to use this to set tasks. This might throw an error because this is defined first, this is declared later. So let's push this up. Okay. Alright, the error is gone. The next thing we do is we take the existing list of tasks and modify it ourselves, and then update the state. So let's say updated tasks list, make sure the tasks exist, and then let's have it as any for now. So we're going to go through a list of tasks and find if any of the IDs match the ID of what has been like dragged. If it does, then let's return the rest and update that one, like the status of it only. Destination and if not, let's just return it. Alright, and then after this we set tasks and then pass this new list. The task state itself holds the data from the API. As we remember, this is the, so if we go I do use this React DevTools to inspect which components have what state. It's very easy to use. So we go to board and we check the state. So state contains this like field tasks. So in order to map them in here, we do have to indicate tasks that task. I know this might be a little bit confusing. We might rename it something else. No. So if this exists, then this should work. Let's say put this back. Another thing too, I guess, since we're still having this problem to solve this, is instead of waiting to fire this function during onDragEnd, we can start updating the state. There's another function that React DND has. It's, I believe, when user starts moving the task around. So another way would be, instead of only calling onDragEnd, also start updating the state as soon as user like starts to move the task. We're not gonna focus too much on that right now. We're gonna move on with the next feature, which would be setting up authentication. We'll be using this Next.js library, and the way we'll configure authentication would be, the method would be passwordless magic link login. This is kind of like a new way of letting users log in with just sending a link to their email, and Slack that does it, and then a bunch of other applications also use it. For the next Auth.js, so let's take a quick look at it. It's easy to use, and then later on, if you want to, you can build in like support for other popular services like Google, Facebook, GitHub even, or just use username password store. It's also could be integrated into Auth, and it's very flexible way, and you can like make it work with like any database. And then it is secured. It sends like assigned prefix server only cookies. You can configure how like the token validation is done, and like what callbacks to be passed using like JWT. This is some of the code that we're gonna use. So yeah, basically you wrap your components in the session provider, and then in the options you tell what kind of configuration you want. And then for the email passwordless, like email signing, we would have to configure like an email server, but yeah, we'll get to that. Let's set this up first. So get started. Just gonna install the package. And to configure this, first we need like a authentication API that we would call when we want to sign in like from the client side. The way that we declare APIs would be here, but for this one we would have to, for next to detect as auth API, create new folder, name it auth. We do have to use specifically this name, and then also the name of the file needs to be 3 dots next auth.js. Copy some of the configuration from their page. So we are only using, so we are importing the next auth, we are creating Prisma client, and then we're passing the Prisma client to it. Also for email, as for options, we're passing the email provider. Next thing we need to do is go to the process.env file and then create variables for all this. So let's open this. So you already need to have in here like database URL. We're gonna add SMTP host. It would be different variables for you too, so I'm just gonna add the constants. And then secret is actually, so these are all the fields you need. Right here you can actually generate it in your terminal, so using this command right here, and then press enter, and then it will generate a secret for you, and then you copy it and paste it in here. As for the SMTP host, port, user, and password, you would have to configure an email server, and then for the service I use the Sendgrid. So you just copy any email server, you configure, you're gonna go to the credentials, and then it will provide the host, port, user, and password. A quick guideline for how to set up Sendgrid's SMTP credentials. You start for free, create an account. Over there you select that you want to use email API, and for the email API also you need to set up a sender. Address is the email sent from. So once you configure the sender, put in the information for that, then you can go to API itself, like create a key. You can press here. I'm going to include this link also in the description. So create API key with mail permissions, and then and then you can set the port to 587. Okay, and then as for the adapter, we are using Prisma adapter, which in the past it used to be included in Next.js module, but it's not anymore. But there is a separate module that we can install for that. So here it is compatible with TypeScript, so we're just gonna copy this. We don't need to, we have all the other modules, I believe. We can check, but let's paste it in here and remove this one. While that's loading, we do have to wrap our app into the provider of like session from Nexus client module. So let's go, so that every like component would have access to basically the session. And then once they have access to the session, we can get session ID, session like user information, and then we can use the client's Next.auth module. Client module does have this login, sign out functions, and even it constructs the login page for you. So we can just basically use those. So let's first import session provider. Similar to like Apollo provider, this is just the wrapper to pass on the data. It would be from Next.auth React. And then pass the session object. Or it can find name because we also need to pass it in here. So let's do component, and then for the page props, it would include both the session and then rest of the page props. Login page, and to test out this session and how it works, pages, new file, login.tsx. Here we import React, and we're gonna need use effect. Some elements from React Bootstrap. And our functions for the client side. So it's sign in, sign out, and we also have use session hook available. Let's declare component. Alright, and then in here, let's call the session data, name it session. Then this equals to use session hook. We'll also need router because if user is logged in already, we want to redirect them to the board. So in that case, let's use effect. So if session object exists, then router push. This is like Next.js router that we are using here. Board. And then this only gets called when session is updated. So let's create a card. Give it a class name. A header, let's say login. And the body, which will be kind of like a form, and then in here we create button, calls primary, and then on click, once you click on the button, it will redirect you to the sign in function from Next.js. Login. Alright, I believe that should be it for the login. Let's navigate to that page. Semicolon. I have not defined this as maybe TypeScript. That's the oops. Oh yeah, because we're declaring here type and JavaScript couldn't read that. Okay, let's navigate to login page. Yeah, here it has Next Author's email provider does need a node mailer module. It's weird that it does not itself install it, but that's fine. We can install it. Your server, just because when there's like a API change, usually it does need to restart the server. And then let's press the login. Here we have the sign-in page provided by NextAuth. We put in our email here, click sign in email, pop-up that says notice that says check your email box. Go to your email, click the link that should redirect you to login page, and then login page, once it detects you're logged in, it's gonna push you to the board. So one more thing is that in order to be able to use this with Prisma, as in like create an account, manage like a session token, etc., we do need to follow like a specific model, which is indeed declared in this NextAuth documentation. I'll also link this. So this is how model looks like. It's like user has this fields, whether email has been verified, name, etc. Then we have a account table where we have all this like provider data, when the access token, so when user logged in their granted access token, when does it expire, user ID, secret state, etc. Then there's a verification token, which is generated once they press the email, and then the session information. We can take this models and then add our data on top of it. So I'm just gonna paste that and go to our schema.prisma. And paste it in. So we made updates to user, we added account, and then session fields in here. Role remains to be same, task is same, so we added the account model. Per their documentation, we added session, verification token. Let's save this, and then we would have to push our changes to Prisma, and then npx prisma db push. Okay, on our GraphQL server, we are getting this error of like cannot find module micro. Npm install micro. Again, navigate to query our server. We can also check it from reloading Prisma. The link in your email, it will redirect you to the board page and you'll already be logged in. So like, let's make use of some of the functions from NextAuth in the header, and specifically let's update the hard-coded name that we have here. For that, we would need to use session to get the session object, and also let's add sign out button for the sign log out here. And then as for the name, we're gonna fetch the name from use session, and then we'll store it as a state. So let's create state for that, name, set name, and then default would be string of type string, and then empty string. And then let's use effect hook, in which we'll first check if the session object exists, meaning if user is logged in. If it is, we'll say set name. Actually, first what we can do is we can console log this session and see what kind of object is it. And this use effect, we want it to be fired every time session gets updated. So if you lose user logs in or logs out. Also for the session, let's use the next auth object, data set name of session. This equals to use session. And we have a user field and then name. Go ahead and set name here of session that user that name. And instead of this hard-coded, we're gonna replace it with the variable name. And also let's update this logout button. Indeed, we probably don't need link here, but we can just add on click equals to and then pass the sign out function from next auth. All right. Okay, so the last final thing in terms of functionality that I did was to update this assigning task functionality. As you recall in the beginning, when we created this task and the models either to add the task or update the task, for the assign to the options, we left it blank. And then we never actually, when we created a task or updated a task in the query, we never actually passed the user. So for that, use several steps. You can follow the steps. So first I went ahead and went to the task component, which would have the, or we can start with, so there's two modules. One is for the update task, one is for adding the task. Let's start with adding the task. In here, we need to fetch all users. That would be the list in the drop down. So I use this users query. We only need ID and the name. So that's the fields that I indicated. Then created a hook to capture this data and passed all users query GQL query to the use query. And inside the form select, what's happening is that first I'm checking if user data is loaded. We are mapping each one of the user as an option. So the value of the option is ID, key is also ID, and then it displays username. Also, as you know, in TypeScript, when you're mapping certain list of certain objects, you need to pass the type. In here, I did pass user type, which I created just because user is a type that we could use in multiple places. I added it in our the global types folder. So in types, I created user, declared the interface, and then passed the fields. So that's what's happening in add task model. And then in terms of updating, I did update the handle task create function. So what this would do is that since we're letting user not they don't have to assign tasks to someone, it could be unassigned. So first I'm checking if assign to value is set, and then this assign to gets updated when this the form select gets updated. So it gets set as an ID of user. If it exists, we'll set this variable to assign to. If it does not exist, by default it's gonna pick the first person on the list of users, kind of how Jira does. And then after that, we're passing this user ID to the query. That's for the add task model. In terms of the update one, I did follow the similar process in terms of getting all the users, using the query to load them in the dropdown. Only thing is that if we're updating the task when we open for example, if it is actually set to a certain user, we do want to display that user. And in order to be able to do that, we need to fetch which user the task is assigned to. And then for that, I had to make some updates in the schema itself, because at first we did not have that field. So to take a look at the schema updates real quick. So in here, I was using the user in capital letter, which is not the practice that Prisma is following. So I did update that in the schema. And then if we go to the GraphQL itself, once you load the API, the GraphQL, this file gets automatically generated. So you don't have to change this file as long as you load localhost 3000 API-task, which is our GraphQL endpoint. So this will automatically update in here. And next thing I did is updated the task in GraphQL types itself, where we have all the queries and mutations. So in task, I added user ID field, and then I added this field user, which would go through the list of users. And the reason we're using find unique Prisma function, because it's one relationship, as in one task has one user. So it's going to find the user with the ID and return it. So for this one, once we update our query in board, because board is the place that we are calling all the queries. So tasks, I added this because we also want user ID information. Once we get to the board section, we are passing all the data, and then inside the board section, when we are creating the task component itself, we do need to pass this user ID. And let's see what got changed inside task component. So then again, the type that task component is accepting is task itself. So then we do have the task type here. So I added user ID as like optional in here. And then in this structuring, I also added the value for user ID. So what's going to happen is, instead of having this assigned to have an empty state, if user ID exists, then we would automatically set it to that user ID. If it does not exist, then it will remain to be empty. And then in terms of same thing goes for the handle task update. We check if the task has been assigned to a certain user. If it has, then in the query for the update task, we will pass the user ID. I know this workflow takes some time to get used to, but to like quickly summarize, if you're changing something, starting from the backend, the first like source of truth, like database structure, is defined under schema.prisma file. So every time you make a change in this file, you do npx prisma db push command. So that will push changes to your like upstream API. Then the next thing that's happening is you're gonna go to your GraphQL API, reload that. In terms of making changes, so the schema GraphQL file automatically gets updated. You don't have to touch it. But if you do want to change some of the types or like some of the queries over there, you do need to go to GraphQL types folder and update them over there. Once you update this, then that's when this file gets automatically updated. So once that happens, the good practice is to, if these are types that are used in many components, to update the TypeScript types that we have here, just to make sure that everything is typed properly. And then you go to the UI components itself. If it's something, you add a query or an update a query, and then update how they're displayed in JSX, or maybe you don't even need to do that. All right, to take like final look at our project, we can make, I guess, small like quickly styling updates so that this is wrapped, like the main component has some padding around it. So let's do that, and as you remember, that's part of the layout. So and we can do that in our main file. So I'm gonna close all this real quick. Yeah, let's and inside the layout we can have this container. We can also, I guess, have added this container in the layout itself. Right, and then we can add some padding to the test component. So maybe in here, padding 2. Maybe that's too much. Alright, to quickly go over everything, we did authentication, we did creation of like different statuses and like sections for all these tickets, we did ticket creation, ticket updating, assigning to the users, we built our Prisma database, we use GraphQL queries, and I guess that's pretty much it. I want to thank you everyone who sticked around, who watched this video. I hope you had as much as fun as I did, and please let me know if you have any questions, if you need help with something, or if you have ideas for what should the next project be. Thank you so much.